Hello and welcome to Connecticut Politics Live. I am Joe Aguirre. This is part of our five-part series as we talk media literacy. And of course, I can't talk media literacy unless I've got my buddy Barth Keck with me. Barth is in his 32nd year teaching English and his 18th year as an assistant football coach at Haddam Killingworth High School, where he teaches courses in journalism, media literacy, and AP English language and composition. Follow this guy on Twitter at KeckB33. Barth, appreciate you coming back on so we can continue this conversation. You're the expert here.
I'm not the only expert here, as we're going to see in just a minute, but I always appreciate coming on with you, Joe, and talking media lit.
Now, I don't know if I've told you this or not, Barth, but I teach at Connecticut School of Broadcasting. And on the first day of classes, and there's always one student who's shocked to hear this, I explain to them that there's no one that tells us what to say. They don't hand out talking points, that it's all on your own. There's no media conspiracy. As I tell them, journalists can't keep secrets. No media conspiracy, and it seemingly blows their mind. Do you run into that where you have to tell students, like, there's not CNN and MSNBC are competing?
Yeah, I think at my level, probably they don't know what to think. I mean, I don't want to disparage high school kids, but they are very nascent in their understanding of the media. So, I think there are a few, they get their influence from home, obviously, more than anything else, that probably are suspect and do believe that you can't trust any media, right? That's just kind of like the overall feeling that you get sometimes. But in a lot of ways, I think kids, their understanding of the media is so new and that they're really a clean slate, So I'm going to guess that you probably see students that are somewhat older than I do at the high school level. So your students have been around the block a little bit as opposed to mine. So there might be a little bit of a difference, but nonetheless, you can see sometimes that influence from the outside, particularly from the family, creeps in a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we are going to warn you quite a bit tonight about the evils of social media, but there are some positives to social media, including our first guest, who we only know because of his relationship on Twitter with Barth Keck. So we are very excited to bring back Ben Boyington. He's an advocate for integrating critical media literacy into K-12 schools. He's a veteran high school teacher and the father of two teenagers who immersed in the worlds of anime, video games, Discord, and Twitch. We'll have to find out more about that, Ben. He's a member of the Media Freedom Foundation board. He designs and conducts teacher trainings with his partners at Mass Media Literacy. In his daily life, he works with high school students on self-driven learning at a high school in rural Vermont. Ben is also one of the authors behind the book we'll be talking quite a bit about, The Media and Me, a Guide to Critical Media Literacy for Young. You can also follow him on Twitter at BenBo370. Ben, welcome back.
Thanks for having me on again, Joe. It's great to see you guys.
So we had John several weeks ago, and by the time it was all said and done, you were like, oh, maybe you want to talk to some of the other authors, and we reached out, and as it is, they're all very excited to talk about their different experiences. Barth and I had a really great conversation yesterday with Mickey and Nolan, two of the other authors. Let's now also welcome, again, one of the other contributors to this book, Andy Lee Roth. He is the Associate Director of Project Censored and coordinates the project's Campus Affiliates Program. Andy, welcome to Connecticut Politics TV.
Thanks so much, Joe. It's a pleasure to join you, Barth, and Ben to talk about media literacy today.
It's such an interesting topic. And Barth, yesterday, and I mentioned it to these guys pre-show, but we had a situation where I teach at a trade school, you're high school, Mickey does community college, Nolan's at a university. And so we saw four very different perspectives. And again, we're sort of all dealing with people at different levels, and you just sort of alluded to the younger people. Again, most of the influences that they have or biases are probably what they're hearing at home. So my first question off the top is, how much do we talk about confirmation bias? How well do kids understand what that means? And are they able to step back and take a look when it's pointed out?
Well, I'll go first. The confirmation bias, the whole concept is really generally new to high school kids. I see what's called a heterogeneously grouped, group of students in my classroom, which means they come at me from both mostly seniors, some 11th graders, but a variety of ability levels. And so there is some basic understanding of confirmation bias coming in. You have some kids that are taking, psychology classes as electives as well. And then you have the kids that have no idea. So I think that they are receptive to the idea. How well they understand it, I think, takes time depending on the individual student. But at the high school level, I think it in general is a new concept to kids. I mean, obviously high schoolers, teenagers are very prone to peer pressure. And, with confirmation bias, you're looking at the different ways that they build their value system. And number one, it comes from their families, obviously, but number two, from their friends, their peers. And so I think that at the very least, it helps hopefully get them away from that, to make a distance from their peer groups and kind of like see it from the outside if they really understand what confirmation bias is all about. But it's an uphill struggle. I'll admit it. It doesn't happen right away. It's something that it's one of those concepts. And we in media literacy, I'm fortunate. It's a full year class. It's one of those concepts that you keep coming back to. I have this. I'm talking too much, but I just want to. I have this concept which I call Vuja Day, which is really it's my take on what's called the Bader-Meinhof effect, which is when you hear something in school, for instance, like a new vocabulary word, and then you go home and you hear it on TV and you're like, wow, that's really cool. I just heard that today. Now, it's not really the first time they've ever heard it. It's just that they were made aware of it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so what I say is, we have these Vuja Day sheets that they have to fill out from time to time when we do this lesson. What concepts have we heard before? And one of them is confirmation bias. So that through the year, you kind of build that understanding and, you layer it so that they can see the various applications and, repetition. Obviously, it's one of the keys to advertising, right? Repetition is very effective. So it doesn't come easy, but takes time. But you got to kind of, build it throughout the year.
Ben, how about you? What's your experience like with your students?
I mean, I just, as far as that part goes, I would echo what Barth said. I think that, it is a new term. And many of the things that we deal with when we talk about media literacy, when we talk about logical fallacies, when we talk about rhetorical tools and techniques, those are very new to young people. But I would sort of hasten to add here that, gee gosh, they're pretty new to a lot of older folks too. Or it seemed to be. Maybe there are things that were forgotten. But, if there's a reason why on Facebook you have the 32 image meme of all the logical fallacies with the referee, in the pinstripe shirt. And, we've all seen that. But there's a reason that exists because people don't know what those are or they've forgotten. And, we see confirmation bias all over the time in all of our public discourse, whether it's digitally based or otherwise. So I think, to say it's sort of a unique problem to high school or schooling kind of misses the point. Now, I would say that it would be great if more of us were doing that work in high school so that they were leaving with an understanding of these things and an awareness and a questioning of, how they're being manipulated, which is, of course, key to the book. So I'll hand off to Andy.
Yeah, my training is as a sociologist, and my classroom experience is in a variety of college and university settings. I've taught in private liberal arts colleges. I've taught in the California State University system at Sonoma State University, and I've taught in the California Community College system at Citrus College in Southern California. And I'd say across the board, there's a difference between, I think, knowing the concept and thinking of it as an analytic tool and having experience of the phenomenon, right? And I think in that regard, the students I've taught in sociology classes, not necessarily focused on media, like an intro to sociology class, students, right, part of what a liberal arts education is intended to do is to encourage self-reflection. And so confronting one's own assumptions and biases is part and parcel of what you do in a classroom, I think. But that doesn't mean that students have a well-developed vocabulary or set of tools to talk about it, at least at first, right? That's part of what Barth is talking about. Like, you introduce the idea of confirmation bias, and maybe it sinks in for a few students the first day because it resonates with something from their experience, or they're just quick on the uptake. But then you come back, and that repetitive process is part of how you make something your own, right? How you integrate it into your own way of understanding. And so the beauty of a concept like confirmation bias, or some of the other key ideas we introduce in the Media and Me guidebook to critical media literacy for young people, the beauty is, like, many times these concepts resonate with experiences that students and young people already have. But it provides them a new standpoint, new footing from which to engage that experience, right? Or to articulate that experience. And I think that's part of what's exciting about being in the classroom, right? Is seeing a student at that moment where it clicks, and what was before like a concept with a definition to be memorized or something suddenly becomes like a tool. They feel like it's theirs. They know how to use it now, or they see that it would be useful to learn how to use it. And that's very exciting from a teacher's standpoint, right?
I don't want to get ahead of us here, but Andy gave, I think, a very interesting point about liberal arts education. And, there was an article in the New Yorker several weeks ago about the essentially the disappearing humanities curriculum and humanities majors and English majors. And, because schools have become more, colleges and high schools have become more vocationally oriented, and because kids want to have a job. And so we got to teach them skills. And what Andy just explained was, the importance of a liberal arts education, and that the fact that, these are concepts that, maybe it's not going to get you a job, but it's definitely going to help you on a job, and it's going to help you to think in the greater world once you graduate. And that's really, I think, the sad truth, if we really are losing our humanities education, that this is all part of what you want to learn, you want to be able to apply to your life. And kind of as Andy just said, it's these terms become real when kids see them, and they okay, now I get it. And hopefully, we're able to continue to teach this kind of information, and if we can, but it's not easy because, schools are very market driven now.
Yeah. And I think that there's a translation that has to occur, I think, for students. Talking with college students, right, by the time they're juniors and seniors in college, they're definitely thinking about what's next, right? But I would be talking mainly in several of the schools where I've taught with people who had decided one way or another that sociology was a major or a minor. So there aren't direct career applications of that major. It fits in what Tim Wise talked about in a Medium article from 2019. He talked about, we hear a lot about STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, right? And Tim Wise was writing about what he calls MESH, which is media literacy, ethics, sociology, and history. And he was saying, writing in 2019, so rewind in your brain, where were we in 2019? We're pre-pandemic, we're in the midst of perhaps one of the most divisive periods in American political history. And he's arguing, and I think he's fundamentally right, that media literacy, ethics, and sociology and history are as important a component of a young person's education as the STEM coursework that there's so much emphasis on now, because it directly translates to marketable skills. And so with my students, I would say, look, you can't go to a job interview and say, well, I understand, Durkheim's conception of organic and mechanical solidarity. No one's going to hire you. But if you go to an employer and say, look, I understand how power dynamics work in an organization, and oh, by the way, I can engage in critical thinking and express myself in complex sentences in writing, there may be people who are interested in hiring you. And so it's a translation task, I think, for both teachers, but especially for students in higher ed who are, doing their coursework in media literacy and ethics out of a philosophy background, and sociology and history and other of the humanities.
The word empowerment, by the way, has come up an awful lot in these conversations. And again, Ben, I think we even maybe had discussed this last time. For a lot of people, and probably people more right than left, their idea of media literacy is, Snopes fact checking all the conservative websites, right? How do we know? And so again, I think it's important that people really, when we talk about empowering young people, and as Barth wrote several weeks back about empowering adults too, which I think is important in this book, by the way. This is for people like my mom as well. You can read this book; it would be awfully helpful. You wanna tackle that one, Ben?
About power and about the partisanship question?
Yeah.
I think that, okay, so I read a piece in the Real Clear Politics sort of opinion section of their website last week, and I want to say the author's first name was Ben, but it was very clear, like 12 words in, that this guy had a bias against teaching media literacy, and his whole piece was about it was like scare tactics, right? Oh, the left and woke education, and it was all this sort of like the buzzwords, and it was really frustrating. A friend of mine sent it to me, and I wrote him I think it was like an 11-point, rebuttal of this, 3-page article. But the fellow was, there's a point inside of all of the criticism he was offering that, because when we do critical media literacy, we look at political economy, we look at ownership, we look at who's behind the scenes controlling what's happening. 5 companies own 90% of the media that we consume. That's a problem. And it's not a problem because those companies are right-wing or left-wing. It's a problem because media should be about multiple voices. Media should be about breadth of perspective. And when you have 5 companies, all of whom essentially have the same agenda, which is money, controlling all the media, then you're not going to get anywhere with kind of representing the breadth of humanity that we have in this country. I would suggest to you that media literacy is empowering, and media literacy, by its, sort of purpose, is nonpartisan in the sense that it's about getting us to be informed, getting us to understand and question. And that's, I guess that the partisanship would be that critical media literacy is anti-status quo.
Yeah.
So if that's partisanship, then I'm all in. And if it's not, because I don't think it really is, because it's questioning all of that structure. We were talking before the show a little bit about the DNC's role in the 2016 election, and about, now that the GOP and Trump's been indicted, and who came out against him among the Republicans? Nobody, right? They all did their lockstep. We're going to defend this guy's indictment as political machinations. Well, maybe it is, maybe it's not. But like, none of you could come out and say, oh, whoa, wait a minute. We have a criminal here, or at least a question. And it's very strange. So as for the partisanship, I mean, I say, like, it is about power. I said this last time, like, we can hold the power. We need knowledge and understanding to take it back. And we make a strong point in the beginning of The Media and Me about questioning. Critical media literacy is about questioning. It's about skepticism, not cynicism and rejection, but skepticism and opening a conversation, right? I probably said this before. Cynicism ends a conversation. Skepticism opens a conversation. That's what we need to be doing with this material and with looking at media in the same way we might look at politics directly, but you really can't look at politics without looking at media, especially today. Right. And I'll drop a reference to Andy will be able to give me the name of the author better than I can, but the Second Priorities book.
Nicholas Johnson.
Yeah. I had Nick Johnson. I had it almost right.
Nick Johnson, but he makes FTC commissioner. Yeah.
Right. And the thesis, right, is that no matter what your priority is, you got to address media literacy first, right? You got to address media. Because if you don't have that, you can't do anything else. And my friend, Bob McCannon, no longer with us, but he had a version of that where he said, you can't address political reform without media reform. You can't address education reform without media reform, right? And he went on, he had a whole, sort of list, but that was his rhetoric, was to hit those points. So, again, whatever your own ideology is, political ideology, if you understand the media, and I mean understand, not reject and assert fake news and those kind of behaviors that we see, but if you really understand it and you really look at it, it's going to do nothing but empower your purpose, on this planet.
I'll add that, this is the crux of critical media literacy, right? And, one of the common complaints is that there are no good sources. All the media is bad. And, that clearly is it's a talking point. The MSM, the mainstream media, it's like, well, what is the mainstream media? Define the mainstream media for me. These are all the elements of media literacy that I think Ben is talking about, that if you really want to be an informed citizen and a responsible citizen, you need to understand what you're talking about when you just don't parrot the talking points that whatever, political party is projecting out there. So it really is about understanding, looking behind the curtain, for lack of a better term, right? And that's media literacy. It's kind of, seeing what's going on before jumping to the conclusions. That's really dumbing it down, I suppose. But because our understanding of the world today in 2023 comes from where, first and foremost, the media, which in and of itself is, go define that. Let's start there. So,
right.
Yeah, let me pick up on the looking beneath the surface that Barth mentions, because that actually resonates with one of the metaphors that we open The Media and Me with, which is the idea of an old-fashioned clock with the big hand and the little hand. And we make a distinction between, there's a difference between being able to look at the clock and tell time. The big hand is on the 12 and the little hand is on the 3. It must be 3 o'clock. Right. All of us learn at some point how to tell time. But there's a big difference between being able to read the surface of the clock to, quote, tell time, and to be able to look beneath the surface and understand the mechanisms, the gears, the wheels, the springs that are driving the big hand and the little hand of the clock. And that's our metaphor in some ways for what critical media literacy is about. We have no doubt that anyone who reads this book is already engaging in the media in some way, right? You don't need to understand how algorithms work to use Facebook. You don't necessarily have to know anything about concentrated ownership of media to read the New York Times. But, and here's the beneath the surface component, when you understand about concentrated ownership, when you understand about the power of algorithms to filter some stories and make them prominent in your news feed, and to marginalize other stories and make them all but impossible to find unless you go looking for them specifically and intentionally, now you are engaging media in a different way, in a way that we argue, going back to your question a moment ago, Joe, empowers people. And that has actually, I think only at a sort of secondary or tertiary level is that about red versus blue, conservative versus liberal kind of understandings of who we are, and has much more to do with, again, what are the mechanisms beneath the surface that shape the media as this kind of omnipresent part of our lives in a digital connected age, right? Through which so much of what we understand about the world, arrives to our consciousness. So I think that empowerment component is hopefully one of the great enticements of critical media literacy for young people who won't necessarily get excited about maybe learning critical media literacy. But if you can convince young people that they might get more enjoyment or find less frustration when they're online because they now understand some of these ideas and they have a bigger perspective, I think that's perhaps a place where we can start to appeal and say, although this is work, it's work that will be rewarding to do.
I brought this up on yesterday's show. I'll be curious to get Ben and Andy's take on this. We were talking about, and I'm sure you guys know these folks, the do your own research crowd. They've read on the left, they've read on the right, they took a little bit of both, and they've got it all figured out. And they don't, clearly. They never do, from what I can see. Andy Nikki brought up yesterday Dunning-Kruger, to sort of explain something. I don't know that we do enough teaching. I guess here's the other thing. Students that are taking your guys' classes, this media literacy, they're people who I would think are not like the regular students. I think they're a little more informed and a little more connected to today, which makes me worry about the students who are not taking this elective class when they graduate and walk out of there with literally no idea how to understand media.
Well, I want to poke that one a little bit. In my teaching in media literacy, it actually was a very wide range of not only how level of achievement kind of students, like seriousness, like in the standard sense of, oh, that's a good student, he does all his work, he can say. So we had the sort of like the high achievers, and we had the less engaged, and it was a great mix. It was a truly heterogeneous grouping, heterogeneously grouped course, and I actually find that that mix actually like cross-pollinated. There was an interesting thing of, oh, well, you already know about that, I don't, and what do you mean that? And that the conversations were kind of richer for that. That said, I firmly believe, it's in my bio, that media literacy needs to be required, right? It needs to be built in, and it actually should be built in across the curricular areas to whatever degree we can pull that off. Mm-hmm. I used to say when I was teaching the class at the first school where I piloted it and brought it, and my colleagues like, oh, you and your class. And I'm like, no, actually, I think it'd be great if I didn't have to teach this course. It would be great if this course went away, because it was a one-off singleton, this is this course. And why? It should be everywhere, certainly in the humanities arc of classes, but, science, I have a harder sell for it in math, but it fits certainly the three, because for me, media literacy is sort of the most truly interdisciplinary study that I've worked with, politics, economics, sociology, communication, English language arts, history. It's all built in. It's all in there. I could do a whole school that was founded around this idea. Me and Tim Wise should get together, right? But truly, like, I don't think you can separate them. And I think that it's all the richer when you can bring together people who have, lots of already awareness and lots of knowledge, and folks who are like, wait, what's that? And some of those people in both of those categories and all in between would leave my course thinking new thoughts, thinking about, I had a kid come back to me and at one point and say, like, oh my God, my parents won't watch TV with me anymore. And I said, what do you mean? He said, because when the ads come on, I just start talking about how they work. I said, yeah, my work here is done, you know. It was great. And that's what happens, as Andy was saying, when you can activate that knowledge, when you can deepen that experience. And I have kind of a twist on Andy's very positive approach there. I also think that one of the great ways to start with particularly with high school students is to activate the frustration, to activate the anger, to show them, not tell them, but show them that they're being manipulated.
Mm-hmm.
Because then they can, you can take that kind of, wait, what? And you can turn it into an academic discussion. You can turn it into an idea discussion. You can delve into that. And then you can get to the more positive angle that Andy was talking about. You can leave that with a constructive approach of, great, now I understand it better and I can go do something with this rather than just, be upset or not be aware. So
I'll add, I agree 100% with Ben talking about making it a school-wide concept that's integrated into other classes. It needs to be organic. One of the joys I get from teaching media literacy is that, in as much as I'm teaching media literacy, I also have to teach some history, and I also have to teach some literature, and we got to read at least sections of cool books. And, my personal guru, Neil Postman, who was, wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death. And we just started our unit on technology in society today. And we read an excerpt from Technopoly.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And it's that stuff I love. And it's just, that could be something that comes out of a sociology class, for instance. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it should be throughout the curriculum. And that's really, and as far as the idea of centering it around, making a school like a magnet school, for instance, Ben, when you do that, let me know.
I'll be in touch.
That would be wonderful. I would love to do that. The last thing I'll say on this is that I also do in my own class, I bring media literacy into my other English classes, especially language and composition, the AP class I teach.
Yes.
Because it's all about persuasion. That's what rhetoric is. And so, in fact, at the end of the year, we even do like a little media lit unit, once we get done with the test and all that stuff. But it just fits right in. So it's just an organic kind of topic that really should weave throughout the entire high school curriculum.
And since we're nerding out a little bit here, I'll share my total geek moment. I had one of the last times I had a full media literacy course. It was very exciting, and I took. We had this discussion about secondhand television, kind of like the secondhand smoke idea. And we read a CNN report, and they were like, well, what? How do they know that? What do you mean studies show? What's that all about? I found the study, right? I called up the aforementioned Bob McKinnon, and he had a subscription to Pediatrics Magazine. I said, Bob, send me that article. And he's like, okay. So we sent that article, and I developed a whole piece experience with the students to look at how, because I didn't know, I had to figure it out, to look at how do you read studies? Right? How do you break it down? And what is N? And what is, how do you look at why do they have the section on further research or the section on methodology? And I kind of did this whole, it was like a 2-day kind of unit on how to read studies. And I really got into it. They were kind of looking at me like, you're a little too excited about this, Boyington. But it was really fun. And it actually got us somewhere, because then when you say studies show, here's the skepticism, right? Whose studies, right? And when you get that study, there's always that opening section in the very tiny print says who paid for it, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're looking at a smoking cessation study and it's paid for by Philip Morris, and the Reynolds company, you got a question, right? And so you have to dig for that kind of stuff, but that's part of the skepticism. That's part of the questioning that we all want our students to do.
During the election, I ran into a situation where I was literally reading from a study. I think it was by Marist, well documented, and it was people's opinions on the Supreme Court. And I got some feedback from my listeners. Who's Marist to decide all this? And I was like, all right. I came armed because I knew this ignorance was going to come up, and I read off the credentials of Marist and their polling and how it all works. And I've done that in the past with specifically Republican candidates, because they tend to be the ones that discredit the polls. And Barth, as you know, in Connecticut, the polls were dead accurate. And the Republicans, they lost by exactly what they were supposed to lose by. And leading up to it, they're getting killed, and they're like, no, we've got internal polling. It's a lot closer. The second one of our congressional races got close and their guy went ahead by a point, suddenly it was the gold standard of polling. And you know, I pointed that out to the listeners, and I'm like, you guys not see how these folks are lying to you when it suits them. And if you can recognize that, I think you're like one step closer to kind of getting things figured out.
Well,
Which kind of takes us back to confirmation bias.
You took the words out of my mouth, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say one of the things we talk about in a very like the initial framing of the Media and Me book is how media is about interpretation. You know, like we're talking about meaning, and meaning requires interpretation, right? One of the examples we use that is from everyday life is you need to be able to understand, if you're going to get along with people, the difference between a wink and a blink, right? If I'm just blinking my eye, maybe it's dry, maybe, you know, something, but if I'm winking,
maybe you're alive, because that's one of the things that the original deep fakes didn't do, right? They didn't.
Right. But if I'm winking, now you have to interpret, well, what am I doing, right? Is it get a load of that? Is it I think you're hot? Is it, you know, right? And so meaning doesn't come pre-labeled or predetermined. It's an interpretive process. And so like that's kind of, I think, ground zero for a lot of the humanities and social sciences, and indeed for critical media literacy. But where we take it from there is to talk about validity, right? Where, you know, how do we say that a statement or a claim is a valid claim? What makes for validity, right? And one of the key things is evidence, right? When I say something is valid, it means I have reason to believe it's true. But the emphasis there should be on reason to believe, right? This is what Ben was saying a moment ago about skepticism opens a discussion, cynicism shuts it down. And if I say I have reason to believe this is true and we're in dialogue, then you're going to say, well, tell me your reasons, right? Or put another way, what's your evidence? And if I just say, well, it's because I think so, that's not, my argument may be strongly articulated, but it's not necessarily valid. Right. And so getting at some of that, I think the idea of like the more extraordinary the claims, the stronger the evidentiary basis needs to be. That to me is one of the core ideas that we try to convey in this book, both in terms of interpreting other people's claims, whether it's the New York Times or your best friend's opinion on, you know, the latest Billie Eilish song. But also in terms of formulating and articulating our own beliefs, right, and sharing them with other people, right? That if I'm going to say, well, I think critical media literacy is important and everyone should study it, right? Maybe we have a bit of a silo effect going on in this conversation today, but the trick is then to provide some evidence for why that's so, right?
You know, Andy, you just explained one of the core principles of my language and composition class in AP. I mean, it just shows you how we can weave this throughout the curriculum. And that is, it's all about persuasion. And if you're going to write, for instance, an argument essay, you need to have a clear defensible thesis that's backed up by evidence, right? I mean, and that's how the history department teaches, you know, how do you write a history research paper? And, you know, so it really, and, you know, it just shows you just how, I don't know, omnipresent media literacy is, or should be anyway, throughout the curriculum.
Right, because I think underlying media literacy, which it's important to not sell media literacy short, that's really an umbrella term for a whole host of literacies. Ben was talking a moment ago about how do you read and interpret a peer-reviewed scientific study, right? That's a form of literacy, information literacy, we could say. But underneath all the you know, the news literacy, visual literacy, understanding algorithms and technology. Underneath it all, I think, are the fundamental set of critical thinking skills that I'm sure Mickey and Nolan were talking some about yesterday. And those, I think, don't have a political agenda attached to them, other than maybe the kind that Orwell was talking about when he wrote the essay, about politics in the English language, right? About the idea that we ought to be as clear as possible about what we mean, so that people can't be fooled and lied to.
Right. Or as George Carlin does in his famous video about euphemisms, in which I used to show, it's kind of from that one. But yeah, it's, I mean, I mentioned this on yesterday's show, the whole concept of doublespeak and how, students need to recognize these signal words and, the dog whistles, the words that really, they have a meaning below what they're saying. And kids need to understand that. That is, again, all part of questioning and all part of, what we're talking about with media literacy.
I think two things. Carlin, I once showed 7 dirty words in class. So the kids were great with it. The parents were not so happy. Actually, the father was really cool. He's like, I'm not yelling at you. I'm just wondering why. We talked about it. But the other thing is, I was thinking as Andy was talking at the beginning about that, about, understanding arguments and understanding. I think there's a piece to understanding the media and our use of it that's really about understanding ourselves, which of course is what most of education ultimately could be about. But I think that's a really important point. And one of the things that I find in these conversations, people ask me about media literacy, and quite often what they're asking about is, most often maybe, is journalism and news literacy. And I think we want to not lose the full scope, right? We want to be aware that there's more to it. I mean, think about media as a teacher. Think about media as, right, like in our lives. Like what are some of our earliest memories, particularly people, my students' age or our students' ages, right? It has to do with something to do with television or music or the internet, the tablet they had when they were 3, right? The games they were playing, for good or for bad. I don't know. I'm not going to judge that right now. But it does affect us. And I used to ask 9th graders, independent media literacy courses, what are the things that have influenced who you are as a person? Like we talk about personality development, 9th grade English. And they'd be like, oh, parents, because our parents are our first teacher. Okay. Teachers. And I try to get them to friends, because that's a big one, right? I try to get them to media, and somebody inevitably would say it eventually, right? They might not use the word media, but they might go, oh, TV, and in my age group, it was Saturday morning cartoons. So media creates an understanding for us of the world, not just in the factual sense, but in our sense of empathy, in our sense of expectations, right? You talk about these, TV shows from the 90s, like Friends, 6 single, struggling New York City dwellers who live in monstrously cool, large apartments and can afford to go get coffee and hang out every single day. And Joey's an out-of-work actor who apparently never works and still can pay for that apartment with his buddy. What? Right? So the expectations that it creates are also ridiculous. And the more we think about all of that and then leaven that with the idea of representation and who's behind the scenes, creating the stories, deciding what stories are being told, not only in news, right, but in fiction. And when you start to break that down, that's where we get into like understanding ourselves and questioning why we believe what we believe. And we can pull in academic stuff like Mean World Syndrome and George Gerber's work around, how the media perpetuates our belief that that life is dangerous and scary. And it's not nearly as scary as it's presented in the media to us. I'm oversimplifying. And the feedback loop part of that, right, which is also really important to look at, like, oh, we see something in the media that scares us, we react in a certain way against that, and then that goes back and forth and back and forth. So we have to be really aware, I think, of all those factors. And that's why I think it does go to who we are as a person in a very strong way. And certainly also, to go back to kind of news, who we are in the public discourse, which means who we are as a group, as a society. Mm-hmm. Oh, we lost Barth.
Barth, yeah. Oh, that was
He's like, I'm done. Screw you guys. I'm out of here.
Yeah, Barth said his piece, and now he's done.
Mic drop.
I often talk to my mom. One of the warning signs I give her when she's reading news stories, I say to her, if your blood is boiling at the end of an article, there's a good chance that person had that exact agenda in mind.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really important point to become aware of. And it goes to the final chapter of The Media and Me is called, What Do You Want to Do? And the idea is, well, you've made it all the way through this book, or maybe you've been jumping around in this book and you picked up the final chapter. But it's the idea that all this learning, the whole point of critical media literacy is to enable us to engage in an informed and intelligent and compassionate way. And my favorite, so this final chapter I'm talking about has 10 kind of points that are takeaways. And my favorite one is, I'm actually just going to read it because I love how we worded it. I hope this isn't, I didn't actually write this, but I love how we, the group of us that wrote this book, wrote this. It's engage with media at a pace that makes sense for you, rather than at a speed dictated by media producers or peer pressure. And the link there for me is that when something engages us emotionally, a lot of the critical thinking processes that we're talking about today get short-wired or are temporarily put on mute, right? And that can be, as you say, intentional on the part of the person who created the message to get us to react emotionally and fervently. And that's exactly when I think it may be important, not just for young people, but for all of us to, take the proverbial deep breath, to slow down our reaction and give ourselves a minute to engage these critical thinking processes, to engage, I like to talk about flexing our critical media literacy muscles, to actually let them engage before we respond. And I think Nolan Higdon in his book about the anatomy of fake news makes exactly this point too, that it's very important when you react emotionally to be able to take a moment and just react and recognize this caused me to have an emotional reaction. And that's not, there's no judgment of that. It's just a noticing, right? That then you can, but that opens the space, the noticing opens the space to then begin to get kind of analytical, if you will, about, well, what was it about this that made me feel powerfully that way? And again, I think, there are life lessons here, not just for young people, but for people of all ages, because if you spend enough time using social media or engaging other forms of media, you will encounter things that are going to push your emotional buttons. And maybe that's, some of that is often good, right? Arguably, the point of art is to spur us. The point of a novel, if it's written powerfully, is to make us feel things. But what we do with those feelings, not everything that happens on Twitter is great art, and some of it is intended to rile us up. So we need to have resources for dealing with that. And I think that is part and parcel of what Ben was talking about earlier about kind of the power of critical media literacy to encourage self-reflection. To quote the great English poet John Lydon, anger is an energy. An energy, yeah.
And how we use that energy is really, really important. And I think that I wanted to say something. I sort of built on that, Andy, that we put in the book, that idea about slow down and move at your own pace. And this wasn't entirely me. I might have gotten it from Allison or one of our other co-conspirators, but I sort of played with it. And I think that the next step of that is when we want to share something. I made the point recently that the the first thing we want to do is slow down and think about why we're sharing it, not just click share. Oh yeah, click, click, which we do all the time. I do it. And then I had a suggestion. I said, you know what? Instead of just sharing, when we share, we should try to open a conversation. We should try to ask a question about the piece that we're sharing, or share what our takeaway was. Oh, I think it meant this, and it touched me, or made me think about blah, blah, blah. Or challenge it. Oh, this part's BS because, and do something other than just share. Because sharing without context, I mean, it's kind of cool if the people watching your feed know that you're the kind of person who's going, here, do with this what you will. I'm not taking a stand because I want you to have a conversation without me. But that doesn't happen, right? Unless you spark it. So I think that should be our mode, right? Is some kind of, how do we spark that conversation? How do we inject that, maybe that skepticism that opens that conversation? Mm-hmm. And that's a sort of an added layer, for the slow down idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it takes more time to think about, well, what is it that I would like to point people to in this, right? So that opening the conversation is more than just your thoughts, ?
Right. And if you ask,
which I think is kind of like the hollow version of what you're talking about.
I think so, absolutely. And I think that by trying to come up with what your takeaway is, or asking a specific question, you are thinking more deeply about the material that you're reading. So so the idea not only encourages conversation, but it encourages sort of self-reflection and adoption of the content, which makes me remember a time Bob McCannon, again, bringing up Bob, I was on a listserv with him, and I would just kind of post things and not say anything. And he's like, Boyington, how do you feel about it? Like, take a stand on something. And maybe that's what he meant, right? Was that I wasn't taking a stand and I wasn't sparking a conversation. I was just throwing it out there, and that's not enough. Yeah, I didn't take it that way when he said it, but hindsight being 2020, maybe there was more to what he was ranting about in that moment.
Much like the do your own research people who post stuff and will post it on Facebook and be like, I'm not looking to engage. I'm not that political. I just posted this. And it's like, you thought enough about it to post it. You think that you're just going to post that without comment from anybody? Mm-hmm. That kind of thing. I got thrown off of Facebook for engaging with someone who took that stance one time. I have a new account, so don't worry about me. But, that kind of stuff burns me up. And I think a big part of what I do and what's allowed me over the last year to basically do liberal radio on a conservative radio station is I'm not trying to convince people. I use facts. I tell the audience, fact check everything I'm saying. I can't afford to be wrong. I can't afford to say things that are wrong, or you'll never listen to anything. You would have no reason to. One of my favorite things to do is to cite conservative think tanks when I'm trying to make a point that they're not going to like, so that they can't question the source. And I will tell you this, over the course of a year with this audience, I have slowly made headway where when I come on, and Barth, you'll be on again, as you always are when I do my weekly fill-ins there. They suddenly like the fresh perspective. And I got an even better compliment recently. It sort of got passed to me through a friend. A guy was listening to me who I know his wife. I don't know him. He happened to be listening, and he came home and he said to his wife, "You'll never believe this. I was listening to a conservative radio station. The guy was saying stuff I couldn't believe they were allowing that." And I thought to myself, I appreciate the compliment, but I think even people who consume media think there's an element of control to everything that's happening. And I think that's scary too.
Well, I mean, I think if we're talking about the corporate media, and I'll specify it, say corporate news media, there are not necessarily control, but we're talking about large organizations that for people to do their work, there has to be a division of labor where everyone understands what's happening and when. And in sociology, this gets talked about in terms of conventions, shared ways of doing things, right? And so there are conventional ways of reporting a story that when we're talking about corporate news media, just one example will kind of give a flavor of what could be an entire like semester of sociology of media. When when journalists working with establishment news outlets go out to find and report stories, they tend to look for sources of information and perspective who have some sort of official status, right? So they are government officials or they're corporate spokespeople. They tend not to be the neighbor who's a mom, right? Or even necessarily, except in certain cases for certain kinds of stories, the school teacher, right? They're the bias for a good source for who counts as newsworthy is someone with some sort of official status. And that convention fundamentally shapes how news professionals see and understand the world. They understand the world, and this is research that was done originally by in my field in sociology, Gay Tuckman, Mark Fishman, Herb Gans, all of whom did long, in-depth field work at news organizations to understand how news people do their jobs on a day-by-day basis. So the upshot of this is that if we're going to talk about the most fundamental bias in kind of establishment journalism, it's a preference for official sources, which means the world for journalists is filtered through kind of bureaucratic lenses. The lenses, in effect, the worldviews of people as they are in these institutional organizations, and that is arguably a more fundamental bedrock kind of slant or bias in news coverage than any of the kind of typical arguments we get when we talk about, are journalists and news professionals predominantly liberal in their political affiliations, and how does that shape how they report the news? And so I mention that because I think, it's a complex thing to say, well, the news isn't like controlled or predetermined. There's not a conspiracy theory per se, right, to tell us something. But there are strong organizational forces at work that shape how, Ben mentioned a while ago, with concentration of ownership, 90% of the media that we encounter is controlled by, depending on how you count, 5 or 6 major corporations, and that includes news, right? If these same pressures are operating on all those 5 or 6 organizations, that explains a certain homogeneity of news that you can see if you just turn the TV on and flip through, during the evening news, you flip from one station to another quickly, and you'll see basically the same set of stories coming up. Well, how did that happen? It wasn't a grand conspiracy, but it's that they're all playing from the same kind of conventional playbook of who and what counts as newsworthy. And so I think I'll wrap this up quickly here. I think a lot about one of the most political aspects to me of critical media literacy is informing people that there are alternatives to the corporate version of journalism, and that there's an independent press in this country that is arguably as robust and diverse as it's ever been in the history of U.S. journalism, and that turning to it, especially for students who would tell me, Andy, I don't pay attention to the news because it's too depressing, right? Well, there's solutions journalism. There are outlets like Yes Magazine and the Solutions Journalism Network that report a whole different kind of news that isn't like happy Hallmark card, everything turns out okay in the end, but is serious news with a different focus than what you get on the evening corporate news. And I think that's a really important part that goes back to all kinds of themes we've been talking to today, but one of them being empowerment. I think a lot of corporate news is intended to trigger that mean world syndrome response and to convince us that we as individuals and as communities don't have much efficacy, don't have much agency in shaping our own lives. And that's a message that depoliticizes people, that disengages people. And so independent journalism provides an important counter to that.
The book is called The Media and Me, A Guide to Critical Media Literacy for Young People. A big thank you to Andy Lee Roth, Ben Boyington. Thank you for coming back again. I appreciate you gentlemen sharing your insights and your expertise. I really enjoyed today's conversation, so thank you both.
Me too. Thank you.
All right, we shall talk again. Barth Keck kicked into action last minute. Thank you for joining us on this, Barth. Love talking media literacy with you, and I feel like again as this series continues, we've learned a lot about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you started the show by saying that I'm an expert. I'm not an expert. I mean, and that's the thing about this very topic is that because like media itself, understanding it, media literacy changes as well. You got to try to stay on top of it and stay a step ahead if you can. And the guests that we've had on the last couple of days, they enlighten me. So hopefully, and I would think that they'll also be enlightening anybody who happens to watch.
Yeah. Again, Barth, really appreciate it. We will have you back a little bit later in the week for a couple more interviews as we wrap this series up. Barth Keck, Connecticut News Junkie. Make sure you check him out, KeckB33 on Twitter. Barth, we will talk to you very soon. Thanks as always, my friend.
You're welcome. Thank you, Joe.
You got it, bud. And that's going to do it for this episode of CT Politics TV. Make sure you tune in again tomorrow night at 5 p.m. as our media literacy series continues. It's a 5-parter. We appreciate you watching. You can also get all the latest thoughts and insights, and you can check out all the other episodes by visiting ctpolitics.tv. I'm Joe Aguirre. That does it for me. Have a great night.